Welcome to the overview of language conventions. Now, as we've talked before, conventions is just a big word for rules. So really, this is the study of the English language rules. This is the book that we are going to be using. We don't have class textbooks, so I have to find another way to convey all of this information to you. And so I'm going to use lectures like this or mini lessons in class. We won't spend like an entire class period or a whole week on the elements of language. Also, I wanted to ensure or to reassure you that I didn't pull all of this information from the sky, that it actually is legit information. But again, since we don't have textbooks, I have to find a way to give it to you. So here it is. There are four major parts to this book. The first part focuses on grammar, usage, and mechanics, and that's where a lot of our time is spent. Part two is sentences and paragraphs. These are ways to revise sentences to become a stronger writer and how to use transitions and paragraphs. Part three is about communications. These are the different types of writing. So the informative essay and the narrative essay and the argumentative essay, and then the different types of structures within those essays. So you could write a compare and contrast informative essay, or a compare and contrast argumentative essay, or a process analysis informative essay. And that's what that section focuses on. And then part four is just a quick reference handbook. You know now that you have to cite your source, and there's different ways to cite sources within a paper. There's an APA format, an MLA format, and that's what the quick reference handbook contains. Part 1, the grammar, usage, and mechanics, is split into 18 different chapters, so most of the book, this is what it contains. First is the parts of speech overview, the parts of a sentence, the phrase, the clause, agreement, how to use verbs correctly, how to use pronouns correctly, using modifiers correctly, a glossary of usage, capital letters, and then there's a couple chapters that deal with punctuation. It splits it up for you so it's not all at one time. End marks, abbreviations, and commas, and then a chapter that focuses on semicolons and colons, and then italics and quotation marks, apostrophes, and then hyphens, dashes, parentheses, brackets, and ellipsis points. Then a chapter on spelling, and finally correcting common errors. And we've already covered that in class. That we called that, what did we call that? Common, I can't even remember. It's a difference between then and than. Chapter 1 focuses on the parts of speech, and this is my bad. I kind of assumed you coming in knew all the parts of speech, and it's okay if you don't. The different parts of speech, though, are your nouns, pronouns, adverbs, adjectives, verbs, prepositions, interjections, and conjunctions. There are 8 parts of speech, and so sometimes I will say something in class about a part of speech. Well, those are the 8 parts that I'm referring to. And so again, it's okay if you don't know them. It's kind of like if you're in math class and you kind of have a brain fart and you forget what 8 times 7 is. And you look at somebody and you're like, what's 8 times 7? And they have to explain, it's 56, stupid, or something like that. It's good to know and to be able to identify the different parts of speech in a sentence. It makes life easier as you study the elements of language. But if you don't know them by now, it's okay. It's just kind of like having a brain fart. We could spend the whole year focusing on the parts of speech, but that's not going to help you with the other standards and what you really need to know in order to become a stronger writer. Chapter 2 focuses on the parts of a sentence. If you go into your second foreign language class, which I'm going to guess some of you already are, you may already know these terms. And so it's good to know these, especially as you take foreign language classes, because I think that second year and especially that third year in foreign language, these things start to come up and you talk about them. So what are the different parts of a sentence? Well, you have the subject. Then you have a predicate, which is the big word for a verb. I don't know why we do this, why we call a predicate, and why don't we just call it a verb? Predicate nominative, the predicate adjective, the direct object, and then the indirect object. Those are your parts of a sentence. And again, good to know them, especially in foreign language, and how it all is the same stuff no matter what language it is. It all has the same subject, or it all has the same title, but it's okay if you don't know it right now. Then we have the phrase. There are a couple different parts, or a couple different phrases. There are prepositional phrases, verbal phrases, and then the appositive phrase. And I talk about appositive sometimes, and I just assume that you know what those are. And if you don't know, then you need to let me know so we can do a quick mini lesson over them. Appositives are really super easy. But I don't want you to get confused. There are multiple types of prepositional and verbal phrases. So actually underneath verbal and prepositional phrases, there should have been all these subtitles, or all these bullet points that fell underneath of them. There is like the adverbial prepositional phrase and the adjectival prepositional phrase, and then the infinitive, which falls under a verbal phrase. It's great, again, if you know these. I think this was maybe a 6th, 7th, 8th grade standard for you to be able to identify phrases. I should be able to use the term phrase in class, and you kind of know what I'm talking about. But again, if you don't, that's okay. We may have to go back and do some remediation on it, but right now, we're not. Then you have the clauses. There are 2 different types of clauses, so relax. There's not a whole bunch of stuff for you to remember. There's the independent and dependent clause. Dependent clause, though, is sometimes called the subordinate clause, so I can use those terms interchangeably. Independent, just like what you know what independent means. Independent means it can stand alone. It's a complete sentence with a subject and a verb or a predicate. Dependent, actually, just like you know what dependent means, dependent or subordinate clause depends on an independent clause to make it a complete sentence. Chapter 5 is all about agreement. You have subject and verb agreement and pronoun and antecedent agreement. Now, we've already covered pronoun and antecedent agreement, and we've already done a little bit of work before we had this week break due to winter over subject and verb, but we are going to go back and do this again. Chapter 6 is really where we should be right now, which is about using verbs correctly. And so our ultimate goal is to be able to talk about verb mood. So this chapter is split into different parts too. The first part is the principal parts of verbs, verb tense, active and passive voice, and last, verb mood. So some of you may remember that I kind of just gave you a brief overview of tense and parts and active and passive voice and was like, okay, now we're going to move on to mood. Well, the whole purpose of that is that is our ultimate goal. And my brain fart on my end is that I assume that you already knew some of this stuff, because that's really where we should have been able to jump into, was this mood. So I have realized that I need to backtrack. I don't know how far I need to backtrack, but again, I think I'm going to go with chapter 5 and give you all of that information. If some of you would like to go back even further and understand phrases and clauses and parts of a sentence and parts of speech, then really you need to let me know that. And I can do this recorded lecture over that information and give it to you. It makes life easier if you're to know that stuff if you're going into a humanities profession. So if you're going to major in English or a foreign language, then you probably really need to know all of this stuff. But if this is not your track, then you're not going to have to identify parts of speech to be an engineer. So, if you have any questions or concerns, then please email me or leave a message on the blog, even the Daily Agenda blog. Other than that, we'll talk about it in class.